When given the choice of trick or treat, I always choose trick. Other kids, like my annoying sister, went out with buckets to gather candy while I carried toilet paper and shaving cream. This year, I planned even more pranks, and I counted down the days until Halloween. Of course, Leslie tried to get me to go trick-or-treating with her.
Come on, Robin.
She said, her princess dress nearly blinding me with glitter.
It'll be fun.
Trick-or-treating is for babies, I told her, shoving my pranking tools into a pillowcase. Now stop bothering me or I'll steal your candy.
You do it anyway.
She pouted, but finally left me alone. As soon as the sun went down, I slipped on my jack-o'-lantern mask and was out on the town. My first stop was my next-door neighbor's driveway, where his prized Chevy Impala sat. I had a bar of soap in my hand and a grin on my face before I realized someone had already soaped the windows. With a grunt of disappointment, I chucked the soap into the bushes. Looked like someone else was having their own mischief night. Oh well, I had plenty more tricks up my sleeve. The next stop was the principal's house. I had 2 cartons of eggs ready to splatter his windows, except they were already covered in yolk, empty shells littering the yard. Seriously, who was getting ahead of me? At this rate, I wouldn't get to have any fun this Halloween. To my grave disappointment, the night continued on like this. Mrs. Cat's trees were already TP'd by the time I got there. Mr. Nest's pumpkins were smashed to bits. Mr. Garcia's bird bath was already spitting soapy bubbles. Dejected, I started to head home. I was just passing Miss Longshank's house when a yelp drew my attention. Her dog Sparky was kept on a long lead in the front yard. Right now he was running around like the devil himself was after him. Someone had tied a firework to his tail and lit it. Without thinking, I leapt into the yard and tackled the poor thing, my mask coming off in the process. He hollered, eyes rolling as I grabbed the firework and tugged it free. Just as I was untangling myself, the door opened.
Robin Hepburn, what on earth are you doing?
I booked it, falling over the fence and ripping my jeans. Mrs. Longshank shouted after me, but she was too concerned about Sparky to give chase. By the time I stopped running, I was further from home than ever. Exhausted and dejected, I stumbled along the sidewalk. The streets were empty at this late hour. The little kid's already home in their bed. That's why I noticed him. There was a kid crouched by the edge of a house, fiddling with something. I watched as he straightened and threw it through the nearest window. Flames exploded outward, licking up the curtains. The kid stood there, surveying his handiwork as a scream erupted from within.
Hey!
The figure looked over his shoulder at my outburst, revealing a flash of jack-o'-lantern mask, then took it off. I followed without thinking, intent on catching the kid. I knew he had to be the one stealing my gig, and going too far to boot. I followed him past the neighborhood boundary into the woods beyond. As we left the glow of streetlights, I thought there was something familiar about him. After a while, I lost sight of him. Worried I'd lost him, I put on a last burst of speed, only to stumble into a clearing where he was waiting for me. The mask was in his hand, his face shrouded in shadows.
Who are you?
I was so winded the words were barely a whisper, but he heard.
Don't you know?
He said in a familiar voice. He held out his arms in invitation.
Go on, take a look.
It was hard to see in the dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I started to recognize him. The beat-up sneakers, the denim jacket. As my eyes traveled upward, I met my own eyes, darker and more menacing than I'd ever seen in the mirror.
No,
I said, stepping back.
What?
He said, grinning too widely.
I thought you liked tricks.
What are you?
My legs turned to jelly as I realized I was far into the woods. So far, no one would hear me scream.
I'm a big fan,
he said, watching gleefully as I stumbled.
I just thought this year you could take it up a notch. Aren't you impressed?
No,
I shook my head.
The fire, Sparky, that was too much. I never wanted to hurt people.
Oh, don't be such a Boy Scout,
he said in disgust. I blinked and the next moment he was right next to me, so close I could smell the rot on his breath.
Besides, it's not over. I've got one more trick up my sleeve.
What trick? I jerked away, but he caught my arm, his iron-cold grip so strong it bruised. He leaned close, the scent of autumn decay overwhelming me, and whispered in my ear.
You're standing on it.
Then he was gone. I whirled around, frantically searching for the thing. But after a few moments, I realized I was truly alone. Thinking about what he said, I looked down to the leaf-layered ground. In the dark, alone and frightened, I almost missed it. Something pale, lying among the loom. I bent for a closer look, then leapt back, bile rising in my throat. Poking out of the leaves was a small, limp hand and a scrap of sleeve that even through the dirt and blood, I knew belonged to a glittery princess costume. I go all out on Halloween. Every year in mid-September, I scout the decorations of every superstore and annual spooky shop alike, in search of the latest and greatest decorations for the holiday season. I spend weeks transforming my house into an icon for Halloween, so people from all over town and even the next town over can drive down the block with their families, eyes wide at my collection of decorations, lights, inflatables, fog, and creepy music. There's an abandoned house on my street and a few others don't decorate, so I like to go the extra mile. We set up a security camera on the doorstep to document all of the costumes and call out the best on social media. It's a hit every year. I've seen masks, makeup, and costumes of all kinds. However, I saw something last night that makes me question if I will ever decorate my house again. We were in the final throes of trick-or-treating. There was only a handful of kids left, the crowd drifting away. My husband and daughter had returned from their own route while I passed out candy. They were now sorting through her haul on the living room floor. I was trying to empty my bowl so I could end the night. I could see the last of the kids down the road, the only ones that hadn't come to my house yet. Two animatronics walking together, followed by a skeleton teenager who looked too old to be going door to door. After awing at my spectacle, they came my way, pointing at my hanging skeletons and creepy window decals. They held out their bags with toothy grins, and I loaded the kids up with everything I had. I reminded them to avoid all the fresh food and open packages, and pointed to the camera so they could pose. They thanked me and skipped away, with the teenager saying something rude as they passed. When the skeleton teenager arrived, I showed him my empty bowl, and he said some words I'd rather not say. I shrugged him off.
Better luck next year,
I said, and he followed the boys after giving the finger. As they left, I saw a figure across the street standing in the artificial fog. It looked like a kid in a fuzzy costume, although what exactly I couldn't see. I smiled and waved them over, pulling an unopened bag from behind the door. They just stood there for a while, and I coaxed them over by opening the bag. They shivered and crossed the street, other kids paying them no mind. They moved slowly, creeping inches at a time. I couldn't tell who the costumes was concealing, but I was patient with them. It looked like there was something wrong with their legs, the way they shuffled, and the mask made them look straight ahead. When I got a better look at what they were wearing, I was impressed and unsettled at the same time. The kid was dressed as a sheepdog, but the costume looked very old. It was dirty, but I couldn't deny how good it looked otherwise, like it had been pulled straight from a TV set in the 90s.
Oh my gosh, I love your costume. Did your parents get that for you?
I asked, motioning for them to come closer. I had a handful of candy ready for them. The sheepdog stood frozen. They just stared.
What are you supposed to be this year, A puppy?
I asked cheerfully, keeping the awkwardness at bay. They were looking past me inside the house. I shook a handful of candy to get their attention.
Don't say much, do you? That's all right. Happy Halloween,
I said. They stayed put but held out a crumpled paper bag. I brought it to them, unsure if there was a disability of some sort that I couldn't see. Closer now, I could see the dirt and the fur of the costume. And there was a smell, an awful piercing stench. I pushed it off, thinking maybe the kid was going through a tough time at home. As I filled the kid's bag, I looked into their eyes, which were now very sharp and staring at me.
Are you alone?
They said, but the voice wasn't like a child's. It was deep and raspy like an old man. I jumped but tried to play it off.
What's that, hon?
I said, leaning closer. Goosebumps covered my skin.
Who's in there?
they said, their deep groan of a voice giving me chills. Their large eyes looked past me again, then back up at me. This was a prank, had to be. But the way it talked, the way it wheezed, it was too real to replicate.
Excuse me?
I stiffened and backed away, blocking their view. Behind the mask, around the eyes, it was dark red, like there was no skin.
Are you scared?
They asked. I called for my husband.
You should be going.
I said. Down the road, I saw porch lights go out. I decided it was time to do the same.
Why? I'll have to come back.
There was a beastly groan behind the mask.
Have a good night.
I shut the door and killed the light. I waited a moment before looking out. The sheepdog was nowhere to be seen. My husband walked up, mouthful of candy, asking what I wanted. I went to explain but shrugged and brushed it off. The next morning, I checked the tapes. Everything was fine until the sheepdog kid. It was all distorted and grainy, barely able to make out my altercation with them. But as the night went on, after I went inside, the kid blinked in and out of view, hourly through the night. Every time they would just stand there, silently, eyes locked on the camera for minutes at a time. And I can still smell the rot on the front porch.